Hi, thank you all so much for coming out and joining us tonight. Welcome to the show. We are delighted to be joined by Rakesh Khanna. We are delighted. What happens when you watch your own live stream? You get lots of echoes. Okay. So we are joined tonight by Rakesh Khanna, who will be discussing his fantastic new book, Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India. So tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support indie stores like Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into this local economy. So it keeps our store open, but it also paves your streets when that happens, and it funds the parks and all the amazing things we love about St. Louis. So thank you for shopping local and joining us tonight. Thank you also to our virtual audience, near and far, who will be joining us online. So my name is Evan. I'll be the host for tonight's event. This is our first event of the new year, so we are bringing in 2024 in a fantastic fashion. We do have some additional events scheduled that might be of interest to you. This Friday, we are teaming up with the Very Asian Foundation to present Jean Nguyen Yang and Lei Yuan Fun, who will discuss their new novel, Lunar New Year Love Story, graphic novel rather. So that should be a fantastic event. And then in a couple of weeks, January 22nd, we'll be joined by photographer Robert E. Holsey discussing his beautiful new collection, Missouri, Where the Rivers Run. So be sure to check out those events and our full event calendar on our website, left-bank.com. We do events for all ages, all genres, so there's something for everybody on there. For tonight's event, we are delighted to be joined by Rakesh Khanna. Rakesh is co-founder of Bluff Publications in Chennai with his wife, Rashmi. The company publishes translations of best-selling Indian languages of pulp fiction, folklore, and graphic novels. So tonight's book, Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India, is a beautifully illustrated, fantastic guide to the folklore and real-life stories of the demons, monsters, and ghosts of India, cultures famously rich in tradition and legends. Exquisite Terror magazine says Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India is a must-read entry in the literary search for human meaning. It's a trek through the dark corners of cultural imagination, populated with nightmarish creatures, demons, dark forest stalkers, and all manner of grisly entities. It is also a fantastic read. Please join me in welcoming Rakesh Khanna.
Thank you, Robin, and thanks everybody who has showed up, and everybody online, and thanks to Left Bank Books for having me. I thought I'd just start off by talking a little bit about my background and how this book came to happen. People usually see my name and my face and think they don't match. So I'm from a biracial family. My mother is like white American California, small town person, and my father was from Punjab, India. He came to the States in the 1960s, and I want to say that in a lot of ways he didn't bring a whole lot of Indian culture with him. Like, he brought his music, he liked his Mohammed Rafi film songs, and and he brought his snacks. Like, we would eat paratha and pakoras on Sundays while we watched NFL games. This was back in the 80s, like when I think there was still the St. Louis Cardinals was the football team, and it was hard to watch cricket in America back then, so he kind of adapted to American sports. But he wasn't a religious guy. He was kind of a fan of like Mel Brooks movies and kind of sacrilegious jokes. So I didn't grow up with this stuff. I didn't grow up with a lot of we never went to temple. We didn't celebrate Indian festivals. I didn't get it at home. I did make a couple of trips to India when I was a child, and I got a little bit more from my father's family. My grandmother taught me one Sanskrit mantra. But even from my uncles and cousins who are like more religious and more superstitious, I didn't learn a whole lot. So it kind of happened later. I just want to ask, like, how familiar are people with Indian languages? Like, raise your hand if you could name more than 3. One person who grew up there, one person who moved back. Yeah. So, then raise your hand if you know how many official languages there are. Yeah. So, there's 22 languages which are official, like in the Indian Constitution. They're called scheduled languages, and I think that doesn't include English, which is also like official at government level. So, there's 23 at the federal level, and then at the state level, there are other languages which would be official only in that state. So like in Tripura, which is a small state bordering Bangladesh, like Bengali is one official language, which is also official at the federal level. But there's another language called Gopurok, which is used only like in that state, and it's got about 2 million speakers. So India's population is so huge that like these tiny minority languages can still have like 2 million speakers, which is like on par with like Estonian or some European languages that you've probably heard of. So if you include those languages which are official at the state level and the ones that are official at the federal level, it's probably like 30, 35 languages. And while they're minority languages, like there's a lot of cultural production happening in those languages, right? There's schools that are taught in those languages, government offices that are run in those languages, and there's movies that are produced in those languages, and there's magazines, and there's newspapers, and there's horror fiction, and internet forums and everything. So I think like the Western perception, often people aren't really aware of that. They think of Hindi as being the main language, but it's really only spoken by about 40% of the population as a native language. And then beyond those 35, which have some official status, there's like hundreds or maybe more than 1,000 smaller dialects and languages which are spoken by small communities and tribes around the country. And all of them have their own folklore and their own ghosts and their own traditions. So it gets really vast. And I mean, I tried to cover as much as I could, but it's really, even this book is just scratching the surface. So yeah, but I didn't grow up with any of it, even like the basic stuff. And the first conversation I had with my father about Indian mythology was actually prompted by Dungeons and Dragons. So I don't know how many people have played. I don't know, okay, one person. So like in California in the 80s for geeky kids like me, it was a really big deal. And we all had those books. And one of the books was the 1977 Monster Manual by Gary Gygax. So it's like he took folkloric creatures from all over the world and brought them into the game. So they're things that you can fight or encounter or meet in the game. There's kobolds from German folklore, and elves and dwarves, and kappas from Japanese folklore, as well as like dinosaurs and giant ants and various things. And he sort of quantified everybody. So everybody's got a number of hit points and an armor class, how hard they are to defeat, how much damage they do to you if they attack you, right? And in that book, I think there were only 3 monsters from Indian folklore. There was the Yeti, which I think is probably like the best known of all Indian monsters in the West, right? It's sort of, there's that Christmas movie with the abominable snowman, and the Yeti is totally like come into Western culture. There's lots of different kinds of Yetis. If you go to the Himalayas, there's the whole Yeti taxonomy. There's the really big ones and the medium-sized ones and the small ones, and some that can grow and shrink. But basically, people know about the Yeti. The Monster Manual also had the Naga. People know what Nagas are. Okay, so Nagas are sort of like shape-shifting snake people. And they tend to live or be associated with pools of water or small ponds, which are portals to Patalok, which is the netherworld, where Nagas live, and it's full of jewels. It's supposed to be very rich in gold and jewels. And the Nagas come out of these ponds sometimes and shapeshift into humans and fall in love with humans, and they have tragic love stories. And Nagas are probably I think the oldest Naga myths are from Kashmir in the north, but they've kind of traveled a lot. So there's Naga legends like all the way to Thailand and Vietnam and even the Philippines have Naga stories. And to the west also, like to Iran. So the old Dungeons and Dragons had Yetis and Nagas, and the last one was Rakshasas. So Rakshasas are like the kind of the garden variety demons of Indian, Hindu mythology. So in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, there are all these Rakshasas. And they're usually pictured as humanoids with like these fangs that curve out this way, or sometimes horns, sometimes tails, sometimes they're a little bit, they have some animal features. But in the Monster Manual in 1977, they had a picture with the Rakshasa, and he was like this kind of posh gentleman wearing a silk smoking jacket with a tiger head. And it's funny because that picture has sort of like changed the whole Western conception of what a Rakshasa is. So now if you look at any role-playing game or video game where they have that monster in it, it'll always be a tiger-headed guy, which is not really the way that like Indians think of Rakshasas most of the time. But okay, so that was one book, and then there was another book which came out a few years after the Monster Manual called Deities and Demigods. And I don't think they published that anymore. It was like cultural appropriation on steroids. So they took like the whole pantheons of these various religions and like brought them into the game. So they had like Norse gods and Greek gods and Chinese gods and Hindu gods. So there was a section on Hindu mythology. And they also, they had a number of hit points. They had armor class. So you could, if you had a really powerful character, you could fight them or you could pray to them for divine intervention in the game. And Dungeons and Dragons also has this thing about alignment. So even if you haven't played the game, you might recognize this chaotic evil, chaotic neutral, chaotic good, neutral evil, true neutral, neutral good. It's become like a meme template about alignment. So in my Deities and Demigods book, my father started like looking over my shoulder when I was looking at this. He'd never, shown any interest in teaching me about Indian religion before. But the description of Kali in the book, and I think she's probably one of the more familiar Indian goddesses in the West, right? She's got the blue skin and her tongue sticking out, and she's usually topless with a necklace of skulls covering her up a little bit, a skirt of severed legs. So she's pretty ferocious looking. So she was there in the Dungeons and Dragons book, and her alignment was listed as lawful evil. And this was a problem for my dad. He's like, that is totally wrong. You can't call her evil, even though she's ferocious. She's a slayer of demons, and she's, it's totally. He got really mad at the book. That was the first time I saw him care about anything. So, and then later on, I went to India without my parents, and I traveled around with a friend, and we went to some places sort of outside of the Hindi belt. One of the first places I visited was Sikkim, which is a small kingdom, used to be a kingdom in between Nepal and Bhutan. It was like an independent country until 1975, and it's got a pretty distinctive culture. And even that small state has a few different languages. One of them is called Lepcha. So I think the Lepchas have been there the longest. They're like the indigenous people of Sikkim. And Lepcha religion is really wild. Like they have a huge pantheon of like benevolent deities and malevolent deities and deities that are somewhere in the middle. The malevolent deities are called Moon, and there are a lot of them. There's supposed to be more Moon in Sikkim than there are humans. So I'm going to read a little bit about Moon. But also, I also traveled to South India, to Tamil Nadu, which is the state in the southeast. It's got about 80 million people. The main language is Tamil. And then later on, when I was applying for graduate school, I got in there and spent a couple of years studying in Chennai, where I met Rashmi. And in 2002, we got married, and I moved there. And in 2008, Rashmi and I started this publishing house called Blaft. And our idea behind that was kind of, we were both a little bit annoyed, I guess is the word, with what we were seeing available in English from Indian writers and about India. In the sense that it was all of one particular type of book. Like it was very realist about sort of family stories, social issues, and a lot of it seemed to be kind of exotifying Indian culture. There's a lot about the silk saris and the mangoes and the spices and the vermilion on the forehead. And, Rashmi and I both like very big science fiction readers. We liked crime stories. We liked, I grew up with Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and H.P. Lovecraft, and Rashmi's a big Godzilla fan. This wasn't turning us on that much, right? So and this is just what was available in Indian literature in English. And if you looked at what was available in Indian literature in other languages, it was different, right? Because a lot of this English stuff was being written for like the Booker Prize or to get to sell books to the West. So, but what was being written in Tamil, for instance, was a really different kind of book. So one of our first publications was this, which is an anthology of Tamil pulp fiction. So it's a collection of crime stories, detective stories, a little bit of horror, a little bit of romance, kind of the cheap fiction that Tamil people read. And it's fun, and it did well. And so Rashmi was born in Chennai, but she grew up all over India, so she doesn't read and write Tamil that well. So we got a translator for this book, Preetham Chakravarti, who also recommended that we translate this Tamil writer. So this guy's name is P. Rajanarayanan, and he just passed away a couple of years ago, but he was the state of Tamil Nadu's like most eminent folklorist. He had been collecting stories from all over the state for like his whole life. He's kind of an amazing guy. And so we translated a selection of those folk tales for this book. And one of my favorite parts of this book is a section called Pays and Pisasus. So a pay in Tamil is kind of like a ghost. They're not always the ghost of a dead person. They're sort of, sometimes they can be kind of an evil spirit that arises another way. But there are many different types of pays. And then Pisasu is the Tamil pronunciation of a Sanskrit word, Pisachu, which is like a very old, different than Rakshasas, but another race of like evil spirits that shows up in the Indian epics a lot, Hindu and Buddhist stories. So these folk tales from Tamil Nadu, they had really different pays and Pisasus than I had ever heard of before. By that time, I knew a little bit about sort of the standard North Indian ghosts and demons, but the Tamil stories were really different. There were Jadamanis and Ratakatetiks, who were like a little bit like vampires, but they're like totally pitch black instead of pale, and they have like a big black kutu on their forehead, which is their Achilles heel. If you rub it off, then you can defeat them, and they can like grow and shrink in size, and they have mobs of like deranged elephants that guard their fortresses. They're kind of cool. So that was really exciting for me. And then a little later, we worked on another book with a folklorist from Mizoram, which is a state up by the border with Burma. Mizoram is a really interesting society for me because it's almost like 98% Christian. They were almost all converted to Christianity in the late 1800s. But it's like a really different kind of missionary encounter than you think of when you think of Central or South America. Like they've held on to a lot of their old mythology and customs and folklore, despite being very Christian and going to church all the time. So their whole pantheon of supernatural creatures is really amazing. They have these ogres called Fumpuinu, which will gobble you up, but they're also really fond of snails. So like you can distract them by like throwing snails, and then they'll fight over the snails and give you a chance to run away. And there's Lassi, who are kind of like the hidden folk. They're kind of like elves. They appear in your dreams, and if they like you, they'll bless you with good hunting powers. If they like you too much, then they'll take you away. So you have to be a little careful with the Lassi. But yeah, so she's Sherry Tsangte. She's now based in Chicago, but she was really fun to work with on this book. She really likes the supernatural love stories. So when one of these supernatural creatures falls in love with a human, or it's not always consensual, sometimes they abduct the human. It's usually tragic, but they're nice tales. So anyway, in the process of, we've run this company for 15 years now, and we've done a bunch of translations from different languages, both pulp fiction and folklore. And the whole time I was kind of collecting monsters, right? So with the goal of making a monster manual for all these different states and languages and cultures from different parts of the country. So I don't have an academic background in cultural anthropology or folklore or anything. I studied mathematics, but I think like most of the anthropologists or folklorists I've met, they concentrate on one area. So what I sort of knew about, which I couldn't find any other book like this, was the ghosts and demons from all over the whole country. So yeah, that's how this came to be. And I guess I can read part of it. I'll read from this section on the moon. I'm gonna get some water. So, in the mythology of the Lepcha people of Sikkim, the Hmong are a diverse class of malignant devils. They are the enemies of the Rum, who are the good spirits and deities. In the earliest times, after the goddess Rum created the world, she took the snow of the mighty mountain Kanchenjunga, which is the third highest mountain in the world, which is just on the border of Nepal and Sikkim. She took the snow and shaped it into two beings. She named them Nazong Nyo and Fadrong Ting. While they had the appearance of a woman and a man, they were not mortal humans, but powerful deities. Rum wanted her two creations to live separately as brother and sister. So she made Fadrong Ting's home on top of a small mountain and Nazong Nyo's in the foothills. But as Nazong Nyo and Fadrong Ting grew up, they began to desire each other. Defying her mother, Nazong Nyo built a staircase so she could secretly visit Fadrong Ting at night. Nazong Nyo soon became pregnant by Fadrong Ting, but when her first child was born, Nazong Nyo became terrified of what her creator goddess mother would do to her for breaking the incest taboo. So she asked Fadrong Ting to go and abandon it in a cave in the jungle, which he did. Nazong Nyo and Fadrong Ting kept up their clandestine meetings, and she became pregnant again and again. She bore 6 more children. After each delivery, Fadrong Ting took the squalling infant to the jungle cave and left it there. Finally, when her 8th child was born, Nazong Nyo's maternal instincts became too powerful to deny. She nursed this child from her breast and cared for him tenderly. This became the first human, named Ralbu Singhu. After that, Nazong Nyo bore many more human children and nursed them all. These humans had children of their own. Soon they went out into the world and became the Lepcha people. Meanwhile, the 7 children whom Nazong Nyo had discarded had somehow managed to survive. These beings grew up on their own and became the first Hmong. So, the firstborn son of Nazong Nyo and the first to be abandoned was Lasong Hmong Pano. As the eldest and strongest of the Hmong, he soon became their leader. Lasong Hmong Pano hated his human siblings with a passion. He was bitterly jealous of the way his parents treated them with so much love and affection while completely ignoring him and the other Hmong. He spoke his mind forcefully to his Hmong brothers and sisters, preaching hatred and violence against the Lepcha. It didn't take long before he had rallied all the other Hmong to the cause of wiping them from the earth. The names of the other original 6 Hmong vary in different versions of the myth, but in one telling they are Arot Hmong, who's the demon of violent death, who has a long hooked beak. He haunts Mount Tendron in southern Sikkim, and takes exactly 2 lives every year. He appears in dreams as a red butterfly. There's Sword Hmong, who appears as a woman with long, disheveled hair. She's the demon of lust and wantonness. She also causes miscarriages and less serious afflictions like coughs and colds. Her coming is foretold by dreams of a kite flying in the sky. Dom Hmong is the demon of leprosy. Kung Hmong is the demon of youthful lust, who tempts young lepchas into premarital sex. Sumu Hmong is the demoness who appears in the night as an ugly, dirty woman to harass lonely travelers. And Shen Hmong is the demon who causes rheumatism, body aches, and fever. He lives in rocks and caves in the deepest, thickest parts of the forest. So these are the 6 siblings. As for Lasong Hmong Pano, he was a powerful illusionist capable of changing his shape into many forms. Lasong Hmong Pano began killing many Lepcha people, and soon the Rum, the benevolent deities, decided they needed to put a stop to it. They came after him, but Lhasa Mungpano hid in Sanyo Kung, a giant sago palm tree at the top of the mountain. The room decided to chop the tree down, but whatever progress they made during the day would be undone during the night, as the tree magically regenerated itself. Finally, they enlisted the help of a hairy cat named Patiu who ate through the tree's trunk and sent it toppling. But this only prompted Lhasa Mungpano to unleash his rage in full effect. Taking the form of a gargantuan black bird with eyes of fire, he spread his wings and flew from the tree as it crashed to the ground. Then he went on a lethal rampage through the villages of the Zongbu Valley, gobbling up the inhabitants or massacring them in gruesome ways. In some villages, he simply liquidated the entire population. In others, he exterminated everyone by means of a deadly blast of sound, like the cawing of an infernal crow. No one was safe from the demon. He murdered and ate men, women, and children alike. He would even dig people out of their hiding places and torture them before killing them. The creator goddess, Itbudeburum, decided she needed to create a hero to combat Lhasa Mungpano. From the snows of Mount Pandim, she made the demigod Tamsang Ting. This Tamsang Ting was the hero who brought magic to the Lepchas. He taught the two types of Lepcha shamans, the Mun and the Bone Ting, how to perform their ritual arts. He and the humans began a long war against Lhasa Mungpano, one which lasted many years. As Tamsang Ting and the Lepcha warriors pursued Lhasa Mungpano, the demon tried changing his shape. First he became a mouse, then an ox, then a tiger, an eagle, a dragon, a snake, a horse, a sheep, a monkey, a bird, a dog, and a pig, spending 1 year in the form of each animal. These are now the animals associated with the 12-year cycle of the Lepcha calendar, which is probably a later borrowing from China. I'm not sure how it worked into this myth. Finally, on the 29th day of the last month of the 12th year of the war, the demon was chased to a high valley, and there he was slain by Jor Bongting, who was the first Lepcha shaman. After Lhasa Mungpano was killed, his gigantic corpse was mutilated to make sure he didn't come back to life. His eyeballs were punctured, his limbs and head were cut off, and his still warm muscles were removed, shredded, pulverized to dust, and blown into the air. Some say that parts of the demon's body turned to stone after he died and can still be seen in the rocks. And yet, even then, vitality remained in the marrow of the monster's bones, and new demons sprang forth from them. Today, there are 10 clans called Mu in Lepcha society, and each clan is named for their ancestors who fought in the war against Lhasa Mungpano and the role they played in it. For example, Kurbo Mu are the descendants of those who made the swords and axes to fight the demon. Joribu Mu are the descendants of those who provided food and water to Tamsang Ting and the human soldiers on the front lines. And Simic Mu are the descendants of those who went forward to poke out his eyes after he was dead. So, though their king had been vanquished, the Mu did not stop harassing the Lepcha. There were still Lhasa Mungpano's 6 Mu siblings and their children to contend with, along with the new Mu born from Lhasa Mungpano's bone marrow. The cruel depredations of these demons went on until it became too much for even the gods to bear. Finally, the creator goddess, Itbudeburum, asked Kumya Kumshipting, the mediator of the deities, to come and intercede. Kumya Kumshipting called a general meeting for the room in Moon. It was attended by all the Moon except Dong Moon, who was the demon of leprosy, who somehow missed the message. Kumya Kumshipting gave an impassioned speech imploring the evil spirits to stop bothering the humans. Despite his best efforts, he could not convince them to give up their hatred for humans entirely. But he did get them to promise that as long as the humans propitiated him with some grain or an animal sacrifice, that they would leave them alone. So, from that time onwards, by means of various rituals and offerings, the Lepchas were able to keep the demonic attacks to a manageable level. They were able to find cures for most of the illnesses the moon caused. However, since Dong Moon missed the meeting and never made the promise, there was for many years no cure for leprosy. So, that's insane. That's that one. There's lots more stories, but if anybody has questions.
Yeah, so how did you structure your trip to India when you were researching all these myths?
So by the time I started thinking about this book, I was living there.
Mhm.
So I was just kind of, and we had already sort of started publishing, so I was going to book fairs in various parts of the country,
Okay.
meeting folklorists and talking to people and reading a lot. Yeah. So,
Sort of Greek mythology, did you get interested in that before that, maybe?
Greek mythology I grew up with. I had that Dolores book of Greek myths when I was a kid, and yes, yeah, it's a classic. Yeah, so I knew that stuff, and there hasn't been, I think, like a book on sort of mainstream Hindu mythology that's quite as good as that. I think there was this Indian book series called Amar Chitrakatha, which it was like comic books, and I think it started in the 70s. Does that sound right? People call it ACK, Amar Chitrakatha for short. And that was like a huge comic book series which sort of retold the Ramayana stories and the Mahabharata stories and the Upanishad stories and Buddhist stories. It wasn't all Hindu stuff. They also did Buddhist stories and even some stuff from the northeast of the country, which is like not really Hindu. They were kind of problematic in a lot of ways. Like there was a lot of colorism. Like the demons are always dark purple and the good guys are always super fair skinned. And the depictions of women are like super problematic. But you know, on the other hand, it was comic book stuff, and a lot of people learned their mythology from those. Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, and there's this move now, I think, with the sort of right-wing Hindu movement that's going on in India. There's a lot of fiction now that's coming out that's like English language adaptations of Hindu myths, which are, I want to say like the heroes are portrayed like as really like super masculine dudes and
Kind of graphic novel-ish.
yeah, graphic novels, but I'm thinking more of like prose. That's been a really popular genre in India, and like I'm not crazy about.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
The shapeshifters, I forgot what they were called, sorry, but I was wondering if they were the ones who can jump through these lake portals
The
and what have
Nagas,
you.
yeah, okay.
I'm curious if they're actually immortal. That's what I wondered as I was thinking about it.
I think Nagas are mortal. I'm pretty sure. There's a few conflicting stories about where they come from.
Right.
Like, one just has that there's like a race of Nagas, and some theories are that the Nagas were real people. They were like snake worshippers that the Indo-Aryan like Sanskrit speakers met when they came into the Indian subcontinent from Iran, and they sort of named these people Nagas and then made up a bunch of myths about them. I don't know. Nobody's quite sure if that's true or not. But another way that you can become a Naga is if you're a cobra and you don't bite anybody for 100 years.
Oh.
Right? Then the venom in your skull hardens and becomes a Nagamani, which is like a snake gem.
Wow.
And that jewel is like super powerful and allows you to shapeshift and do a bunch of other magic.
Jeez.
And this is like that Nagamani jewel is like it's the MacGuffin in a lot of Indian pulp fiction. Like people are searching for it, like the wizards are trying to get it, and people fight over trying to find the Nagamani. And if you can get the Nagamani, then you must have been able to kill the snake. So I think they are mortal most of the time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
At one point, you were speaking about the calendar that was like all the animals that may or may not have been imported from China, which got me thinking about the sort of blurriness of all of these cultural boundaries. I assume that you're bumping up against things that could be borrowed from other cultures, or how did you sort of decide on the taxonomy of a book about Indian? Like, how do you figure out what's in, what's out? How do you confront that?
Yeah, I have some stuff in the introduction about that. It's all a little, author's discretion. But like, yeah, so there's so like Tibet borders India, but there's a lot of people who speak Tibetic languages in India, right? Like there's the Ladakhis, like that's a Tibetic language, which is their folklore is very much related to Tibetan Buddhism. And there's Buddhia in Sikkim and parts of Bihar and stuff. So you could call those maybe Tibetan ghosts, but there are also people know about them. There's big populations, minority populations, but again, like millions of people, 10 million people or something speak Tibetic languages in India. And that's not even counting like the Tibetan refugees. Like there's this whole community that came after China invaded that have been living in India for 60, 70 years now. So yeah, and then like I've got Zoroastrian demons in here. So Zoroastrianism is a religion that started in Iran. But there are now more Zoroastrians living in India than there are anywhere else, because there was one big emigration in the 900s, I think, to Bombay, and then another one when Islam sort of took over Iran, like a lot of Zoroastrians moved and set up in Mumbai. So that's got the biggest population in the world now, and Zoroastrianism has some crazy demons too. There's Nasu, the demon of decay. She's really cool. she's like a giant fly.
And did she make it into the book?
Yeah, she's in here. So I counted them as they're Indians, right? Like there's a lot of Zoroastrian Indians, and then in the south, like there's I really like folklore of Maldives. Like Maldives has some really amazing stories, and there's one island like at the very south of the so there's a union territory off the southwest coast called Lakshadweep. So Lakshadweep means like 100,000 islands. So it's like all these coral atolls area down there. And one of those, the southernmost one, is Minicoy Island, which kind of is culturally linked with the Maldives, and they speak Divegi. So I use that as an excuse to put in some Maldivian ghosts also, because there's some ones I really like. There's the who's like another shapeshifter. It floats around in the sea as a log for like centuries, and then it'll like drift up onto the shore of an island and transform into a very handsome man and marry somebody. But in the night, it'll sneak off to the cremation ground and eat all the corpses. The burial ground and eat all the corpses. And finally, when it's discovered, it's too late because it's really powerful and just eats everybody on the island. So there's supposed to be like islands in Lakshadweep that are uninhabited because the berry got everybody. And then it became a floating log again. So yeah, there's a lot of peripheral stuff. And the other question on deciding what would go in and what wouldn't go in is like, because Indian religions don't, the Lepcha religion sort of does have this distinction between the good deities and the bad deities, but a lot of other Indian traditions, that binary dualism isn't so clear, right? There's a lot of, is this a god that you pray to because it's the god, or is it a demon that you pray to because you don't want it to kill you, right? Like you do sacrifices to some kind of malevolent entities to calm them down. So, so we had to, draw lines somewhere. Yeah.
So how did you translate all of it, since I'm guessing there's a lot of different source languages involved?
Yeah, I relied on a lot of English. And a lot of these stories have been written in English, but like often with not very good editing. Like there's a thing that happens in Indian English publishing a lot where people will write in a sort of English dialect that is understandable for people from that part of India, but not really for anybody else. Like it doesn't travel very well outside the country. I used, Friends and Google Translate a lot. I can read a little bit of Hindi and a little bit of Tamil and a very little bit of Telugu. So, I was, trying to sound things out and pick things up that way. But
I got a good one.
okay,
So, have you ever watched the Grimm series?
the Grimm series.
It's on Prime now, but I just got.
It's
stuck
like
in-
Brothers Grimm stories that
Oh.
they.
Yeah, Grimm. It's all fiction. It's supposed to be based on the Grimm.
Fairy tales, yes.
The Brothers Grimm. Yes.
Yeah.
My White Crush Grimm I just seen. You haven't seen that either.
No, it seems like it would be up your alley.
Yeah. I mean,
Because there's all the different monsters there, but it's fictional supposed to be
I mean,
historic.
I love Grimm's fairy tales.
Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting.
I'll check it out.
How long have you owned your publishing company?
We started in 2008, and we have about 30 books out.
Of your own?
No, this is the first one that I wrote.
Oh, okay.
Everything else has been, I've been editing translations or working with graphic novelists or authors of translations.
I had a question. You talked a little bit about the world of pulps in India, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Did it coincide with the pulps in the United States? Was it like the 30s and 40s, or is it later, or how is it similar or different?
I think like it's different for every language. So that's a big complicated question, right? So, so like in Tamil, there were pulps that were happening in like the 20s and 30s, kind of the first detective fiction came in. A lot of that was really derivative, like maybe it was just kind of what they call transplant fiction, where they take an Agatha Christie novel and they kind of translate it into Tamil and they change the names from like, Chandigarh would be, Chicago would become Chandigarh and the pizza would become a samosa, like they sort of like localize it. But it's really plagiarism, but nobody knew back then, right? So that was really common up through maybe the 40s and 50s, and then that continued, like it's still going on in many Indian languages. But I think in Tamil, like that kind of stopped around the 50s, and they started writing their own stuff, like original pulp fiction. Also, like I think in the early 20th centuries, it was very, that fiction was very like Brahmanical. Like all the heroes would be Brahmins. It would be kind of like upper caste characters and upper caste readers. And what happened in the 50s is it kind of got democratized a lot. So there's really different, like the writers and the characters and the readership, like, broadened a lot. So there were a lot of different kinds of readers that came into it. In Hindi, that transplant thing is still going on, and we kind of got burned. We tried to translate a Hindi pulp novel into English and published it, and later found out that it was kind of plagiarized.
What?
It was really artfully done. Like he didn't just take from one book. He took from like 3 books and like was translated, 40 pages from this novel and then 40 pages from that novel, and tying it together with 10 pages of original material, which was actually the best content in the book and was really well written. These guys were under intense pressure to publish, right? So this Hindi author that we published, he did like 350 books. And one of these guys, one of the authors in here, his name is Rakesh Khanna. He's published 1,500 novels.
Oh.
And what they call a novel is a little bit shorter. We probably call it a novella, but it's still maybe like 15,000, 20,000 words. So, he was publishing 3 novels a month for like 20 years. So, the production is like out of control for a lot of them.
On a manual typewriter, probably.
No, he hand wrote these.
Oh, he
found no pen.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was his full-time job.
And his wife typed them, right?
Yeah, he would write them with a fountain pen and ink on A4 paper to a clipboard.
Oh my gosh.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. So that's Tamil and Hindi, and then like every language you look at, you're gonna get a different thing. Like we were looking also into Konkani pulp fiction, which is like the language of Goa around there, which is a really interesting language because of the Portuguese colonization that happened there. Konkani is written in like 5 different scripts. Like it's the same language, but there's 5 different writing systems for it. You can write it in Devanagari like Hindi, or you can write it in Urdu script, or you can write it in Roman script, like the Portuguese style, or you can write it in Malayalam script, or you can write it in Kannada script. So like a lot of those pulp novels are like, they're published with like 1 column in one script and another column in another script. So those were also fascinating. But again, like a lot of those are kind of like dubious originality.
But the Bengali literature does have, I think they were writing science fiction and pulp. I think pretty much late 1800s itself. That's
Yeah.
completely original. It's just that a lot of it has been lost, and in fact, they had apparently this incredible science fiction magazine. I think around the 1920s that we're trying to see if we can get hold of copies of, which had like amazing stories, and one was about this crazy typhoon where the scientists used this coconut oil to sort of dissipate. Remember?
I forget
Yeah,
that one,
so
but there are
there
some-
was like
yeah.
there's been some amazing stuff in Bengali literature that's happened.
I would say like those Bengali books, they have this old tradition of science fiction. They probably don't consider that pulp. They would consider that kind of like, it was cutting edge. They were kind of like borrowing from, they were trying to be like Jules Verne or H.G. Wells. Like,
Yeah.
they were aspiring to that kind of, and I haven't read those books, maybe they're that good. There's a lot of great cover art on those magazines also. They're like really amazing. But there is also Bengali like trash fiction too. That also exists. We're hopefully starting a Kickstarter later this month for an anthology of Gujarati pulp fiction. We had this young intern come to us. She was just 19 years old a couple of years ago. Said like, I really enjoyed this book and I want to do it for my mother tongue. It's Gujarati, so it's spoken on the West Coast. It's about 30, 40 million speakers. And there's a scene of pulp fiction there too. And we thought we weren't expecting too much. She's like 19 years old, but she started giving us like synopsis after synopsis after synopsis and sample translations. And pretty soon it was clear like, okay, we could make a book. And there's some really funny author characters, interesting author characters in that scene too. Like Atom Bolivar is one of these authors who writes like science fiction thrillers. And so, yeah, if you're interested, I think probably in a couple weeks we'll launch that Kickstarter to do Gujarati pulp fiction, and then hopefully it'll come out like the end of this year or next year.
Congratulations.
Thanks so much.
I'm just curious, I'm sure it depends on the region, but like who was telling these stories? Like was it mostly men, mostly women, different casts, different people? I'm sure like different people told different stories.
Yeah, different everywhere, but I do think that there's a lot of grandmothers like in this book. You know what I mean? That we don't know their names, but like there's a lot of old ladies telling stories to freak out their grandchildren.
I think a lot of Asian parents used to do that just to scare their kids to quiet down or something.
Right, like in Bengali, there's this famous, it's kind of like the equivalent of Grimm's fairy tales in Bengali. It's called Takamon Jubi, which either it means or the frame story is it's a grandmother telling ghost stories to their kids. So yeah, grandparents.
So kind of like Grimm. I remember reading something recently where they were talking about how like we had this conception of like Grimm being like written by men, but it was collected by men, but the stories were told by women.
Yeah, I believe that for sure.
And a lot of these would have been oral tradition stories that eventually got recorded academically at some point of time. So I think it's,
I did put
mixture
some
of that as well.
I did put some modern guys in the book, like some more, recent urban legends, like Monkey Man. There was this kind of like panic in Delhi in the, I have to check, 80s or 90s about Monkey Man, who was this like ape that was wearing roller skates and had like flashing lights all over him and a helmet. He was like charging into people's like 6th floor apartments and like causing havoc, and one guy died. And it was this big like, it was all over the news for a while in Delhi.
And also motorcycle Baba.
Oh, and Bullet Baba. So there's a temple in Rajasthan devoted to this. He was like a 21-year-old young man riding his Enfield Bullet motorcycle who crashed it and died. And when the police recovered the motorcycle from the scene and kept it in the police station, the next morning they went to check and the motorcycle wasn't there anymore, and it was back in the ditch where he had the crash. And so they took it back to the police station again, and then the next morning again, it's reappearing in the crash. So then the legend arose that the ghost is like, rescuing his motorcycle and going for midnight drives. So now they have the motorcycle in a temple at the site, and like it's
For real.
Yeah. So Indian bikers like go there and like offer alcohol and tie a little Try
I mean, it's like an urban legend, but just something that it's fun to
Right.
believe in if you're a biker.
Oh, yeah.
But this is also the way like Hinduism works. Like he's a god now. Like people go and like they do go, they break coconuts and do pujas for this motorcycle ghost. So yeah, if that's it then. Yeah, I'll hang around and we can talk more if you want. But thanks so much for coming. Yeah.